The sentiment of mutual kindness or brotherhood is a simple and widespread thing, belonging not only to man in every stage of his development, but extending in a crude form over a great part of animal life. Prince Kropotkin, in Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, has collected illustrations of its universality and significance. The necessity of communicating impressions, he says, of playing, of chattering, or of simply feeling the proximity of other kindred living beings pervades nature and is, as much as any other physiological function, a distinctive feature of life and impressionability. Darwin perceived, what Kropotkin and others have illustrated with convincing fullness, that this fusing kindliness underlies all higher phases of evolution and is essential to the cooperative life in which thought and power are developed. The popular notion that kindly sentiment can only be a hindrance to the survival of the fittest is a somewhat pernicious misapprehension. This sentiment flourishes most in primary groups where, as we have seen, it contributes to an ideal of moral unity of which kindness is a main part. Under its influence, the I feeling becomes a we feeling, which seeks no good that is not also the good of the group. And the humanism of our time strives with renewed energy to make the we feeling prevail, also in the larger phases of life. We must demand, says a writer who lives very close to the heart of the people, that the individual shall be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement, and shall be content to realize his activity only in connection with the activity of the many. Huxley at one time felt this so strongly as to say, "If I had 400 pounds a year, I would never let my name appear to anything I did or shall do." Such utterances, though significant, are one-sided, and it is perhaps more in the way of real progress to demand, not that the sense of personal achievement shall be given up, but that it shall be more allied with fellow feeling. The sort of ambition congenial to the we feeling is one directed toward those common aims in which the success of one is the success of all, not toward admiration or riches. Material goods, one feels, should not be appropriated for pride or luxury, but being limited in amount, should be used in a consciousness of the general need, and apportioned by rules of justice framed to promote a higher life in the whole. Much might be said of the we feeling as joy, for there as much the more as one says our, so much the more of good each one possesseth, and more of charity in that cloister burns. There is nothing more wholesome or less pursued by compunction. To mingle our emotions with fellowship enlarges and soothes them. Even resentment on behalf of us is less rankling than on behalf of only me. And there is something cheerful in suffering wrong in friendly company. One of the most obvious things about selfishness is the unhappiness of it. The lack of imaginative expatiation, of the inspiration of working consciously with a vast whole, of the exhilaration and uplift which come when the individual sympathy and intelligence is caught into the forward intuitive movement of the mass. Fellowship is thus a good kind of joy in that it is indefinitely diffusible, though by no means incapable of abuse, since it may be cultivated at the expense of truth, sanity, and individuality. Everything that tends to bring mankind together in larger wholes of sympathy and understanding tends to enlarge the reach of kindly feeling. Among the conditions that most evidently have this effect are facility of communication and the acceptance of common principles. These permit the contact and fusion of minds and tend to mold the group into a moral whole. In times of settled principles and of progress in the arts of communication, the idea of the brotherhood of man has a natural growth, as it had under the Roman Empire. On the other hand, it is dissipated by whatever breaks up the moral unity and makes human interests seem inconsistent. Not only war, but all kinds of destructive or unregulated competition, in which the good of one party appears to be a private good gained by the harm of another, are reflected in the mind by unkindly feeling. What human nature needs is not the disappearance of opposition, which would be death, but the suppression of destructive forms and the control of all forms by principles of justice and kindness, so that men may feel that the good survives. As regards the bearing of contemporary conditions upon the spirit of brotherhood, we find forces at work so conflicting that it is easy to reach opposite conclusions, according to the bias of the observer. The enlargement of consciousness has brought a broadening of sentiment in all directions. As a rule, kindly feeling follows understanding, and there was never such opportunity and encouragement to understand as there is now. Distant peoples, Russians, Chinese, and South Sea Islanders, alienated classes, criminals, vagrants, idiots, and the insane are brought close to us, and the natural curiosity of man about his fellows is exploited and stimulated by the press. Indeed, the decried habit of reading the newspapers contributes much to a general we feeling, since the newspaper is a reservoir of commonplace thought of which everyone partakes, and which he knows he may impute to everyone else, pervading the world with a conscious community of sentiment which tends toward kindliness. Even more potent, perhaps, is the indirect action of communication in making it possible to organize all phases of life on a larger scale and on a more human basis, in promoting democracy and breaking down caste. Under a democratic system, the masses have means of self-expression. They vote, strike, and print their views. They have power, and this, at bottom, is the source of all respect and consideration. People of other classes have to think of them, feel with them, and recognize them as of a common humanity. Moreover, intending to wipe out conventional distinctions and leave only those that are functional, democracy fosters the notion of an organic whole, from which all derive and in which they find their value. A sense of common nature and purpose is thus nourished, a conscious unity of action which gives the sense of fellowship. It comes to be assumed that men are of the same stuff, and a kind of universal sympathy, not incompatible with opposition, is spread abroad. It is realized that there are diversities of gifts but the same spirit. On the other hand, our life is full of a confusion, which often leaves the individual conscious only of his separateness, engaged in a struggle which, so far as he sees, has no more relation to justice and the common good than a dogfight. Whether he win or lose makes in this case little difference as to the effect upon his general view of life. He infers that the world is a place where one must either eat or be eaten. The idea of the brotherhood of man appears to be an enervating sentimentalism, and the true philosophy that of the struggle for existence, which he understands in a brutal sense opposite to the real teaching of science. Nothing could be more uncongenial to the we feeling than this view, which unfortunate experience has prepared many to embrace. Taking from life, as it does, its breadth and hopefulness, the joy and inspiration of working in a vast and friendly whole. Probably most of us are under the sway of both of these tendencies. We feel the new idealism, the sweep and exhilaration of democracy, but we practice nevertheless a thrifty exploitation of all the private advantages we can decently lay our hands on. Nor have we the moral vigor to work out any reconciliation of these principles. Experience shows, I think, that until a higher sentiment like brotherly kindness attains some definite organization and program so that men are held up to it, it is remarkably ineffective in checking selfish activities. People drift on in lower courses, which at bottom they despise and dislike, simply because they lack energy and initiative to get out of them. How true it is that many of us would like to be made to be better than we are. I have seen promising idealists grow narrow, greedy, and sensual, and of course unhappy, as they prospered in the world, for no reason apparently, but lack of definite stimulation to a higher life. There is firm ground for the opinion that human nature is prepared for a higher organization than we have worked out. Certainly there is, on the whole, a more lively and hopeful pursuit of the brotherhood of man in modern democracy than there ever was on a large scale before. One who is not deaf to the voices of literature, of social agitation, of ordinary intercourse can hardly doubt this. The social settlement and similar movements express it, and so, more and more, does the whole feeling of our society regarding richer and poorer. Philanthropy is not only extending, but undergoing a revolution of principle, from alms to justice and from condescension to fellowship. The wealthy and the educated classes feel, however vaguely, that they must justify their advantages to their fellow men and their own consciences by making some public use of them. Gifts, well meant if not always wise, to education, science, and philanthropy are increasing, and there was never perhaps a more prevalent disposition to make unusual mental acquirements available toward general culture. Even the love of publicity and display said to mark our rich people has its amiable side as indicating a desire to impress general opinion rather than that of an exclusive class. Indeed, if there is anywhere in American society an exclusive and self-sufficient kind of people. They are not a kind who have much influence upon the general spirit. The same sentiment incites us, in our better moments, to shun habits, modes of dress, and the like that are not good in themselves and merely accentuate class lines, to save on private and material objects so as to have the more energy to be humanly and spiritually alive. This, for example, is the teaching of Thoreau, whose works, especially Walden, have latterly had a wide circulation. If Thoreau seems a little too aloof and fastidious to represent democracy, this is not the case with Whitman, who had joy in the press of cities and whose passion was to utter the word democratic, the word en masse. His chants express a great gusto in common life. All this I swallow, it tastes good, I like it well, it becomes mine. I am the man I suffered, I was there. Whoever degrades another degrades me. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. I believe the main purport of these states is to found a superb friendship, exalte, previously unknown. On the whole, Americans may surely claim that there was never before a great nation in which the people felt so much like a family, had so kindly and cheerful a sense of a common life. It is not only that the sentiment has a wider range, there is also more faith in its future, more belief that government and other institutions can be made to express it. And the popular agitation of all countries manifests the same belief, socialism and even anarchism, as well as the labor movement and the struggle against monopoly and corruption. A larger spirit of service is the active side of democratic feeling. A life of service of some sort, in behalf of the clan or tribe, of the chief, of the sovereign, of the mistress, of the church, of God, has always been the ideal life, since no imaginative and truly human mind contents itself with a separate good. What is new is that the object of this service tends to become wider, with the modern expansion of the imagination, and to include all classes, all nations, and races in its ideal scope. The narrower boundaries do not disappear, but as they become less distinct, the greater whole becomes more so. As the child grows until he can see over the hedges bounding his early playground, so the democratized individual has outgrown the limits of the clan or the caste. In the United States, at least, the feeling that everybody ought to be doing something useful is so established that there is no influential class within which idleness is respectable. Whatever narrowness there may be in this spirit, in the way of undervaluing activities whose usefulness is of an unobvious sort, it is sound on the whole and does incalculable service in redeeming riches from vulgarity and corruption. If it be true, as is asserted, that the children of the wealthy with us are on the whole less given to sloth and vice than the same class in older countries, the reason is to be found in a healthier, more organic state of public opinion, which penetrates all classes with the perception that the significance of the individual lies in his service to the whole. That this sentiment is gaining in our colleges is evident to those who know anything of these institutions. Studies that throw light on the nature and working of society, past or present, and upon the opportunities of service or distinction which it offers to the individual, are rapidly taking the place, for purposes of culture, of studies whose human value is less or not so apparent. Classes in history, political, industrial, and social, in economics, in government and administration, in sociology and ethics, in charities and penology, are larger year by year. And the young people, chiefly from the well-to-do classes who seek these studies, are one and all adherents of the democratic idea that privilege must be earned by function. The tendency of manners well expresses that of sentiment, and seems to be toward a spontaneous courtesy expressing truth and equality, as against the concealment and, sometimes, the arrogance of mere polish. The best practice appears to be to put yourself, on approaching another, into as open and kindly a frame of mind toward him as you can, but not to try to express more than you feel, preferring coldness to affected warmth. Democracy is too busy and too fond of truth and human nature to like formality, except as an occasional amusement. A merely formal politeness goes with a crystallized society, indicating a certain distrust of human nature and a desire to cloak or supplant it by propriety. Thus, a Chinese teacher, having a rare opportunity to send a message to his old mother, called one of his pupils, saying, "Here, take this paper and write me a letter to my mother." This proceeding struck the observer as singular, and he inquired if the lad was acquainted with the teacher's mother, learning that the boy did not even know there was such a person. How then was he to know what to say, not having been told? To this the schoolmaster replied, "Doesn't he know quite well what to say? For more than a year he has been studying literary composition, and he is acquainted with a number of elegant formulas. Do you think he does not know perfectly well how a son ought to write to a mother?" The letter would have answered equally well for any other mother in the empire. Here is one extreme, and the kindly frontiersman with no manners at all is at the other. No doubt form in manners as well as elsewhere is capable of a beauty and refinement of its own, and probably raw democracy goes to an anarchic excess in depreciating it. But the sentiment of reality which demands that form and content should agree is perhaps a permanent factor in the best manners. Conflict of some sort is the life of society, and progress emerges from a struggle in which each individual, class, or institution seeks to realize its own idea of good. The intensity of this struggle varies directly with the vigor of the people, and its cessation, if conceivable, would be death. There is, then, no prospect of an amiable unanimity, and the question arises, what change, if any, in the nature of opposition and of hostility accompanies the alleged growth of the sense of brotherhood? The answer is probably best sought by asking what is the difference between the opposition of friends and that of enemies. Evidently, the former may be as energetic as the latter, but it is less personal. It is not directed against the opponent as a whole, but against certain views or purposes which the opponent, toward whom a kindly feeling is still cherished, represents for the time being. The opposition of enemies, on the other hand, involves a personal antagonism and is gratified by a personal injury. Well-conducted sports are a lesson to everyone that fair and orderly opposition may even promote good fellowship, and familiarity with them in primary groups is an excellent preparation for the friendly competition that ought to prevail in society at large. Indeed, it is only through opposition that we learn to understand one another. In the moment of struggle, the opposing agent may arouse anger, but afterward the mind, more at ease, views with respect and interest that which has exhibited so much force. It seems evident, for instance, that the self-assertion of the wage-earning class, so far as it is orderly and in pursuit of ideals which all classes share, has commanded not only the respect but the goodwill of the people at large. Weakness, intrinsic weakness, the failure of the member to assert its function, is instinctively despised. I am so far in sympathy with the struggle for existence as to think that passive kindliness alone, apart from self-assertion, is a demoralizing ideal, or would be if it were likely to become ascendant. But the self which is asserted, the ideal fought for, must be a generous one, perhaps involving self-sacrifice as that is ordinarily understood, or the struggle is degrading. The wider contact which marks modern life, the suppling of the imagination which enables it to appreciate diverse phases of human nature, and the more instructed sense of justice bring in a larger goodwill, which economizes personal hostility without necessarily diminishing opposition. In primitive life, the reaction of man against man is crude, impulsive, and wasteful. Violent anger is felt against the opponent as a whole and expressed by a general assault. Civilized man, trained to be more discriminating, strikes at tendencies rather than persons and avoids, so far as possible, hostile emotion, which he finds painful and exhausting. As an opponent, he is at once kinder and more formidable than the savage. Perhaps the most urgent need of the present time regarding the easing of antipathy is a clearer awareness of what may be called, in the widest sense, the rules of the game. That is, accepted ideals of justice which conscience and public opinion may impose upon reasonable men and law upon the unreasonable. Without clear notions of right and duty, the orderly test of strength degenerates into a scuffle, in which the worst passions are released and low forms of power prevail, just as brutal and tricky methods prevail in ill-regulated sports. What we need is a popular ethics that is at once Christian and evolutionary, recognizing unity of spirit alongside diversity of standpoint, a cooperative competition, giving each individual, group, or race a fair chance for higher self-assertion under conditions just enough to minimize ill feeling. In fact, something like this is the ideal according to which modern democracy hopes to reconstruct a somewhat disordered world. A French maxim often quoted of late says that to understand all is to pardon all. When we fully understand, we cease to blame. This, however, is only half true and becomes a harmful fallacy if taken as the whole truth. It is true that if we wholly lose ourselves in another state of mind, blame must disappear. Perhaps nothing seems wrong to the mind that commits it in the moment, but this goes beyond what we have a right to do. It requires renouncing our moral individuality, the highest part of our being, and becoming a mere intelligence. The fact that every choice is natural to the mind that chooses does not make it right. The truth is that we must distinguish two attitudes of mind, the active and the contemplative, both natural and important, but neither alone sufficient. Pure contemplation sees things and their relations as a picture without judging better or worse. It does not care. It is the ideal of science and speculative philosophy. If one could remain entirely in this state, one would cease to be a self altogether. All active personality, and especially all sense of right and wrong, duty, responsibility, blame, and praise, depends on the mind taking sides and having particular desires and purposes. The unhappiness of bad men, maintained by Socrates, depends on their badness being brought home to them in conscience. If, due to insensibility or lack of proper reproof, the error of their ways is not impressed upon them, they have no motive to reform. The fact that the wrongdoer became such gradually and does not realize the evil in him is no reason to withhold blame. Blame defines evil and declares it publicly. We may pardon the wrongdoer when he is dead or has sincerely repented, not while he remains a force for wrong. The right approach lies between the old vindictiveness and the view now somewhat prevalent that crime should be regarded without resentment, like a disease of the flesh. The resentment of society, if just and moderate, is a moral force, and specific forms of punishment are needed to impress it on the general mind. If crime is a disease, it is a moral disease and calls for moral remedies, among which is effective resentment. It is right that one who harms the state should go to prison in full view of society. But it is equally right that all should understand that this is done for the defense of society, not because the offender is imagined to be a fundamentally different kind of man from the rest of us. The democratic movement, insofar as it recognizes a common spirit in all men, is of the same nature as Christianity. And it is true that while the world was never so careless of religious machinery, it was never so Christian in feeling. A deeper sense of a common life, both as embodied in the men around us and as inferred in a larger whole, in God, belongs to the higher spirit of democracy, as it does to the teaching of Jesus. He calls the mind out of the narrow and transient self of sensual appetites and visible possessions, which we all feel to be inferior in our awakened moments, and fills it with the incorrupt good of higher sentiment. We are to love men as brothers, focus on the best in them, and make their good our own ambition. Such ideals are perennial in the human heart, and sound in psychology as in religion. The mind, at its best, is naturally Christian. When fully alive to life around us, the sympathetic becomes rational. What is good for you is good for me because I share your life, and I need no urging to treat you as I would be treated. Justice, kindness, and humility, arising from awareness of something superior to oneself, become natural. To one fully awake in human nature, love your enemies and do good to them that despitefully use you is natural and easy, because the spiteful are seen as aberrant from the higher life of kindness, and there is an impulse to help them return. The awakened mind identifies with others, living the sympathetic life and following the golden rule by instinct. In other words, Christ and modern democracy alike protest against what is dead in institutions and attempt to bring life closer to the higher impulses of human nature. There is a common aspiration to realize simple ideals of justice and kindness. The modern Democrat is a plain man, and Jesus was another. It is no wonder that contemporary thought is predominantly Christian in sharing the ideals of Christ, and that distrust of the Church stems from the perception that it is not Christian enough. But how far is this brotherly and peaceful sentiment, ancient or modern, applicable to real life? Is it feasible? Is it right? Or is it merely a sentiment of submission in a world that grows by strife? Neither in the life of Christ nor in modern democracy is there sanction for submission to essential moral wrong. Christ brought a sword that the good man of today cannot sheathe. His counsel of submission refers only to personal injuries, which may better be overlooked to maintain conflict on a higher plane. If by Christianity we mean an understanding and brotherly spirit toward all men, with reverence for the higher life behind them, expressed in an infinite variety of conduct according to circumstances, it is always right and feasible so far as we have strength to rise to it. The most notable effect of democracy on religious sentiment is its tendency to secularize it, focusing it on human life rather than a vague other world. Once men see society as not a machine controlled by dark powers, but as an expression of human nature capable of reflecting its highest good, the religious spirit is drawn into social idealism. Why dream of a world to come when there is hopeful activity in this one? God is found in human life as well as beyond it, and social service is a method of worship. If ye love not your brother whom ye have seen, how can ye love God whom ye have not seen? An ideal democracy is inherently religious, and its true sovereign is the higher nature, or God, which it seeks to incarnate in human institutions. Speaking roughly, we may call any persistent social group, other than the family, existing within a larger group, a class. And every society, except possibly the most primitive, is more or less distinctly composed of classes. Even in savage tribes, there are, besides families and clans, almost always other associations, of warriors, of magicians, and so on, and these continue throughout all phases of development until we reach the intricate group structure of our own time. Individuals never achieve their life in separation, but always in cooperation with a group of other minds, and in proportion as these cooperating groups stand out from one another with some distinctness, they constitute social classes. We may say of this differentiation, speaking generally, that it is useful. The various functions of life require special influences and organization, and without some class spirit, some speciality in traditions and standards, nothing is well performed. Thus, if our physicians were not, as regards their professional activities, something of a psychological unit, building up knowledge and sentiment by communication, desiring the approval and dreading the censure of their colleagues, it would be worse not only for them, but for the rest of us. There are no doubt class divisions that are useless or harmful, but something of this nature there should be, and I have already tried to show that our own society suffers considerably from a lack of adequate group differentiation in its higher mental activities. Fundamental to all study of classes are the two principles, of inheritance and of competition, according to which their membership is determined. The rule of descent, as in the hereditary nobility of England or Germany, gives a fixed system, the alternative to which is some kind of selection, by election or appointment, as in our politics, by purchase, as formerly in the British Army and Navy, or by the informal action of preference, opportunity, and endeavor, as in the case of most trades and professions at the present day. Evidently, these two principles are very much intermingled in their working. The hereditary distinctions must have a beginning in some sort of selective struggle, such as the military and commercial competition from which privileged families have emerged in the past, and never become so rigid as not to be modified by similar processes. On the other hand, inherited advantages, even in the freest society, enter powerfully into every kind of competition. Another consideration of much interest is that the strict rule of descent is a biological principle, making the social organization subordinate to physical continuity of life, while selection or competition brings in psychical elements of the most various qualities, to be sure, but capable at the best of forming society on a truly rational method. Finally, it is well to recognize that there is a vast sum of influences governed by no ascertainable principle at all, which go to assign the individual his place in the class system. After allowing for inheritance and for everything which can fairly be called selection, that is, for all definite and orderly interaction between the man and the system, there remains a large part which can be assigned only to chance. This is particularly true in the somewhat tumultuous changes of modern life. When a class is somewhat strictly hereditary, we may call it a caste, a name originally applied to the hereditary classes of India, but to which it is common and certainly convenient to give a wider meaning. Perhaps the best way to understand caste is to open our eyes and note those forces at work among ourselves, which might conceivably give rise to it. On every side, we may see that differences arise, and that these tend to be perpetuated through inherited associations, opportunities, and culture. The endeavor to secure for one's children whatever desirable thing one has gained for oneself is a perennial source of caste, and this endeavor flows from human nature and the moral unity of the family. If a man has been able to save money, he anxiously invests it to yield an income after his death. If he has built up a business, it is his hope that his children may succeed him in it. If he has a good handicraft, he wishes his boys to learn it. And so with less tangible goods, education, culture, religious, and moral ideas, there is no good parent but desires his children to have more than the common inheritance of what is best in these things. It is perhaps safe to say that if the good of his children could be set on one side, and the good of all the rest of the world over against it on the other, the average parent would desire that evil might befall the latter rather than the former. And much of the wider social spirit of recent times comes from the belief that we cannot make this separation, and that to secure the real good of our children, we must work for the common advancement. That this endeavor to secure a succession and desirable function is not confined to the rich we may see, for instance, in the fact that labor unions often have regulations tending to secure to the children of members a complete or partial monopoly of the opportunities of apprenticeship. In Chicago not long since, only the son of a plumber could learn the plumber's trade. As being the actual possessor of the advantages in question, the parent is usually in a position either to hand them over directly to his children or to make their acquisition comparatively easy. Wealth, the most obvious and tangible source of caste, is transmissible even in the freest societies under the sanction and protection of law. And wealth is convertible not only into material goods, but if the holder has a little tact and sense, into other and finer advantages. Educational opportunities, business and professional openings, travel and intercourse with people of refinement and culture. Against this we must, of course, offset the diminished motive to exertion, the lack of rough-and-tumble experience, and other disadvantages which inherited wealth, especially if large, is apt to bring with it. But that it does, as a rule, perpetuate the more conventional sorts of superiority is undeniable. And such intangible advantages as culture, manners, good associations, and the like, whether associated with wealth or not, are practically heritable, since they are chiefly derived by children from a social environment determined by the personality and standing of their parents. Indeed, irrespective of any intention toward or from inheritance, there is a strong drift toward it due to mere familiarity. It is commonly the line of least resistance. The father knows much about his own trade and those closely related to it, little about others, and the son shares his point of view. So when the latter comes to fix upon a career, he is likely, in the absence of any decided individuality of preference, to take the way that lies most open to him. Of course, he may lack the ability to carry the paternal function, but this, though common enough, does not affect the majority of cases. The functions that require a peculiar type of natural ability, while of the first importance since they include all marked originality, are not very numerous, sound character and training with fair intelligence being ordinarily sufficient. Even in the learned professions such as law, medicine, teaching, and the ministry, the great majority of practitioners hold their own by common sense and assiduity rather than by special aptitude. To the best of my observation, there are many men serving as foremen in various sorts of handicraft, or as farmers who have natural capacity, adequate for success in law, commerce, or politics. A man of good, all-round ability will succeed in that line of work which he finds ready to his hand, but only a few will break away from their antecedents and seek a wholly different line. And if their work affords them health, thought, and mastery, why should they wish to change it if they could? I would not have it supposed, however, because I dwell thus upon opportunity, that I agree with those whose zeal for education and training leads them to depreciate natural differences. I do not know how to talk with men who believe in native equality. It seems to me that they lack common sense and observation. How can they fail to see that children in the same family, even twins, as Mr. Galton has shown, are often widely divergent in ability, one destined to leadership and another to obscurity. The two variables of personality, nature and nurture, are without doubt of equal diversity and importance, and they must work together to bring about any notable achievement. Natural ability is essential, but no matter how great, it cannot know or develop its power without opportunity. Indeed, great natural faculty is often more dependent on circumstance than is mediocrity because of some trait, like extreme sensitiveness, that unfits it for miscellaneous competition. Opportunity, moreover, means different things in different cases and is not to be identified with wealth or facile circumstances of any sort. Some degrees and kinds of difficulty are helpful, others not. And yet, leaving out, on the one hand, unusual talent or energy, and on the other, decided weakness or dullness, the mass of men are guided chiefly by early surroundings and training, which determine for them in a general way what sort of life they will take up, and contribute much to their success or failure in it. Society, even in a comparatively free country, is thus vaguely divided into hereditary strata or sections, from which the majority do not depart. If the transmission of function from father to son has become established, a caste spirit, a sentiment in favor of such transmission, and opposed to the passage from one class into another, may arise and be shared even by the unprivileged classes. The individual then thinks of himself and his family as identified with his caste, and sympathizes with others who have the same feeling. The caste thus becomes a psychical organism, consolidated by community of sentiment and tradition. In some measure, the ruling class in England, for example, has hung together in this way, and the same is partly true of the lower orders. No doubt, there is generally some protest against a hereditary system on the part of restless members of the lower castes. Certainly this was always the case in Europe, but it may be practically insignificant. And out of caste sentiment arise institutions, social, political, and economic, like the medieval system in Europe, much of which still survives, whose tendency is to define and perpetuate hereditary distinctions. I have, perhaps, said enough to make it clear that an impulse toward caste is found in human nature itself. Whether it spreads through and dominates the system of life as in India, or remains subordinate, as with us, depends upon the strength or weakness of other impulses which limit its operation. As certain types of vegetation, like the ferns, which at one time were dominant in the forests, are now overshadowed by plants of higher organization, so caste, which we must, on the whole, reckon to be an inferior principle, tends to be supplanted by something freer and more rational. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.